Okay, that should be the end of prep time. Is everyone here?
Yeah.
Are all the judges ready?
Ready-ish. I'll be ready. I'm ready.
I'm
Okay.
ready.
Okay, perfect. So on the government side, I'll begin the 7-minute speech starting right now. On the government side of this debate, I affirm the resolution. The Supreme Court of the United States should rule in favor for Tomnet and Twitter Incorporation versus Tomnet. I provide the following definition. Twitter versus Tomnet is a case that regards internet laws and safety. Twitter was accused by Tomnet for hosting content relating to an ISIS terrorist attack. So basically, how much responsibility should Twitter bear? Should Twitter take any action in the future? Framework. Whichever side proves that ruling or not ruling in favor of Tomnet in the Twitter versus Tomnet case is most beneficial to social media platforms and those that use the social media platforms as a whole should win this round. Now on to contentions. Contention 1, internet safety. Right now, the internet has a lot of dangerous content on it. The ISIS content that Tomnet brought up in this case was a good example. And there's a lot of other misinformation and dangerous things being spread right now, and sites like Twitter are currently not being held accountable for it. This is extremely dangerous because on the internet, misinformation can spread extremely quickly. And as the internet is a growing place, it is accessible to a whole lot of people. This is made even worse by the fact that on these sites, dangerous videos can be recommended to ordinary people, people that don't have any background information on what's going on right now, who can spread misinformation, terrorist ideas, or other threats like propaganda across the internet. That's exactly what happened. In this case, ISIS videos were recommended to ordinary Twitter users, which caused a threat, and that's what Tomnet is looking for. By ruling in favor, we can drastically improve internet safety for all users. For example, such videos will no longer be recommended to users because there's actually going to be a system in place that can check this. This is not that hard to implement. We can implement a system in which we can no longer recommend them, and there's actually a system in which Twitter is responsible for putting these videos on their platform. If there's a dangerous video or something that's going to cause severe harm, then Twitter should be responsible for taking that video down or not making it accessible to the public. The impact is public safety. If there are more terroristic threats, the world becomes a lot more dangerous. There are people on the internet that do not know what to do with the dangerous information, meaning terroristic organizations like ISIS can trick more people on the internet, all because of this misinformation that's being spread by different people. The second contention is ethical responsibility. At the moment, social media platforms are not doing nearly enough to keep the constant flow of misinformation, hate speech, propaganda, or other things at bay on their platforms. We see more public opinion morph for the worse as a result. For example, the January 6th attack was a perfect example of this. This was essentially domestic terrorism and an attack on a branch of the U.S. government by the U.S.'s own citizens who were fueled by misinformation and lies. There are a couple links here. First, it should be the responsibility of these companies to actually take care of their users, which they don't actually do. They enjoy popularity from feeding misinformation and hate because now they're going to earn more money or more popularity, which they're only thinking about themselves and not being held responsible, which ultimately makes social media dramatically less safe for people as a whole. There's another link here. Ruling in favor of Tomnet and holding Twitter, the platform that famously played a huge role in spreading the propaganda that led up to January 6th, propaganda that's spreading ISIS misinformation and other things like that, will make Twitter and other platforms also be held to an ethical standard. This means that they will improve the gaps that allow terrorism to be spread and will also carry out steps to improve other negative aspects of social media, such as depression, the encouragement of suicide, and other negative factors, as they recognize the ethical responsibility to protect their users. Remember, as a platform, they are encouraged to spread good information. The internet is designed to help spread information to gain more access to the world that people didn't have. And as the internet is a growing community by every single day, we need to make sure that this gets into place. The impact is that ruling in favor of Tomnet will, in this case, will lead to Twitter and other platforms which will follow suit, actually taking steps to protect their users and diminish terrorism and other aspects of their platforms. At the moment, they do not recognize that it is their responsibility to look after their users. Rather, they benefit off spreading hateful and incorrect speech on their platforms because again, they're only looking at themselves. Once they are forced to recognize that this is their responsibility after this ruling, they will not only take steps to reduce the threat that terrorism poses on their platforms, but they'll also take steps to reduce other problems like anxiety, depression, and side effects. Remember, right now, this is a good starting point, but Twitter needs to go somewhere else, and this case is going to help not just remove terroristic threats, but all negative threats on the internet. Contention 3 is influence on other platforms or ideas. Basically, we're starting at Twitter. This is a good start, but we need to go in somewhere else. Right now, there are only two cases that are happening about internet safety. One, which we're debating right now about Twitter, and then there's another one regarding Google. The Twitter one actually came off the Google case. Although these two cases are a good step in the right direction, there's misinformation spread on all different types of platforms, social media platforms such as TikTok, Facebook, and Instagram. And what's worse, some chatting services or other kinds of social media platforms have systems in which 2 people or 3 people can talk to each other, and it's not going to be regulated by anyone. For example, services like Discord, in which they just allow people to create public or like private chatting rooms and just spread misinformation among people. This means that there's many dangerous threats to the government, people's safety, just spreading around everywhere, just waiting to be caught. But because of these loose security rules and the laws that previously prevented such cases from being held on the Supreme Court, what that means is there's nothing actually being done. If we rule against Twitter on this case, that'll bring a new light upon all the problems that are happening, and that'll generally reduce negative ideas being circulated. There are 2 key impacts here. First, as I touched on before, other companies are now incentivized to act in similar ways, making for a safer internet. This case is just the start. When Twitter is held responsible, and now Twitter has to take dramatic action, take responsibility, pay these users back, for instance, what's going to happen is now all of these other platforms like Instagram, Facebook, Snapchat, TikTok, etc., now all these internet sources are now going to need to pay or do something else, which is going to incentivize them to follow up themselves, which means that this is not a case just for Twitter, not just for Google, but for the entirety of the internet, which is a growing community. This leads to my second main impact, which is less terrorism or other acts of violence or simply other misinformation spread on the internet. We tell you that right now, terrorism is spreading very rapidly, and we tell you that misinformation can cause people to say not back America and say they're not going to support America because they believe misinformation. They're going to believe a candidate for a government office that's going to rally against America, spread information, or cause terroristic threats. That is not good. Meaning, and when we have less terrorism and less misinformation, that means lives are safe because terroristic threats are not happening. Second, we support the most amount of people. Why? Because now everyone knows that the internet is doing the most amount of good. They can feel secure about posting on the internet and looking at the internet without fearing for misinformation to the internet that is a continuously growing community. For all these reasons, you're looking towards the government side of this debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Rochelle Wong. I'm the first and third speaker for Palo Alto, and I'll be giving the opposition speech now. Is everyone ready? All right. Time to start my first word. We affirm we negate the resolution the Supreme Court of the United States should rule for Tanema and Twitter Inc. versus Tanema. First, let's establish some basic framework. We should be judging on whether or not Tanema should face consequences for his actions on Twitter. Contention 1 is companies. Free speech is important, but you have to realize that when you use a company's services, the moment you log onto the website, you are asked to click agree to terms, and then from there on, you are abiding to the company's policies. Twitter requires that to use their platform, you must agree to their terms of service. Twitter is a state actor, and their policies and actions are not subject to First Amendment restrictions. Twitter is a private company, and as a private company, Twitter is not required to follow the First Amendment, which only applies to federal and state governments. In fact, the First Amendment states that the First Amendment applies only to federal, state, and local government actors. This is a broad category that includes lawmakers, elected officials, public schools, universities, courts, and police officers, and does not include private citizens, businesses, and organizations like what Twitter is. This amendment was created so that the federal government could uphold the rights of its own citizens. In the Constitution, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. Why should Twitter have to abide to this as well, since they are not a state actor, and specifically states that when you sign up for Twitter, you have to agree to accept their terms and policies. This is perfectly legal and happens every time you log into any social media platform. When you sign up for any social media platform, you must check the box that says accept their terms and policies. They have the right to ensure that when customers use their services, they are abiding by their terms of service. Tenema has undeniably violated these terms. He was fully responsible for creating and operating a network of fake Twitter accounts that were used to spread spam and, like our opponent said, terrorism and engage in other fraudulent activities. As a result, he violated those terms and the policies that he himself agreed to when he signed up for Twitter. So he should be held responsible for the action that he took. And Twitter should not be held responsible for taking away his freedom of speech because when he logged onto the website, he'd already agreed to their terms. Twitter has officially stated that Tenema had violated these terms. The consequence from there on should be quite clear. If Tenema violated these terms, he should face consequences for his actions, and the Supreme Court should rule against Tenema. Now, I'd like to briefly touch up on our opponent's arguments. So first, they talk about how right now on the internet, the internet has a lot of dangerous content and can promote terrorism and all sorts of negative consequences, and that Twitter should be held accountable for whatever goes on their website. But you have to realize that Twitter is not responsible in the slightest. There are so many videos and posts posted onto Twitter alone, and you cannot expect Twitter to screen or check through every single one of them. They also talk about how in their second contention, there needs to be a system to check this, but this already happens in the status quo. Twitter already deletes accounts. That means it permanently removes accounts that do this, removes accounts that violate their terms and conditions. And that is the reason why Tenema was sued. He was sued because he thinks that they violated his freedom of speech, when in reality, you have to realize that when you log on to Twitter, you have already agreed to their terms. And this is perfectly legal according to the United States Constitution, where this has taken place, because in the Constitution, it states that private companies are not required to abide to the same freedom of speech rules on their platform. Twitter already has that system in place. They often take down accounts if there is dangerous activity reported. And that is why Tenema was being sued. They also talk about ethical responsibility, how Twitter should be responsible morally, but in this case, it is not about morality at all. We are debating on the terms that already exist right now. We are debating on the terms that Twitter has set and the fact that Tenema has already agreed to these terms by using their website. If he's already agreed, and so sure, maybe Twitter, in a perfect world, if we had unlimited resources, maybe Twitter would have the capability to check through every single video and post posted onto their massive platform. But this is simply not possible. There's too much content to be monitored. So we are not debating. So in that case, it would be about it could be about morality. Maybe in a perfect world, of course, we'd love to have that. We'd love to have all these videos scanned. That would be the moral option, but that isn't possible. We are debating on the terms that already exist. And by using the website, Tenema had already Tenema had already agreed, and after his activity had already violated these terms. They also talk about how misinformation is always spread on the internet, which is true, but at the same time, and social media platforms have systems in place to stop this. When there is a highly debated topic, for example, YouTube shorts or highlights, this puts a link directly in front of their video or blocking a part of it and links to a trusted source on the topic. For example, when there was the COVID-19 virus, Instagram put a blurred screen over the post if they were suspected to be misinformation, which shows that companies are already taking efforts to censor activity that could be potentially dangerous. What is the impact for our side? The impact is that social media platforms already have terms and systems in place to stop terrorism, and they delete accounts because of this. The impact is to stop more cases like Tenema, prevent more cases of spreading and promoting terrorism, who thinks that his rights of freedom of speech are being inflicted, when you have to realize that according to the Constitution, private companies are allowed to limit certain speeches that the users on their platform use. Now, I'd like to touch up on our case again. First, we said that while free speech is important when you use the company services, the moment you log onto the website, you are forced to agree to their terms and abide to their company's policies. And because Twitter is a private company, they are not required to follow the First Amendment, which only applies to federal and state governments, which Twitter is not. Tenema has undeniably violated these terms, making him fully responsible for creating and operating a network of fake Twitter accounts that were used to spread spam and engage in terrorism, promoting terrorism, and other fraudulent activities. Because he was guilty of these activities, he should face the consequences. For these reasons, we strongly negate. Thank you.
All right, is anyone not ready? I'll take that as a no. So my speech will just start on the government case and then go on to the negative case. So without further ado, my time will start in 3, 2, 1. Okay, let's look at where we are in this round. We're arguing whether Twitter should have the responsibility to actually enforce laws that, or enforce like policy that keeps terrorism at bay on its platform. For example, look to Tomney in versus Twitter Incorporated. Tomney spread ISIS propaganda on Twitter while actually agreeing to their terms of services. And so we're arguing whether Twitter should actually be held to that standard, actually making sure that people abide by their terms of services. That is what we're debating here. And with that out of the way, let's move into our 3 contentions. First of all, we tell you in our contention 1, how this ruling would promote internet safety, as Twitter would be held responsible and accountable for allowing this terrorist information, misinformation, propaganda, all sorts of hate speech to circulate on its platform and actually be recommended to generate as many clicks and as much ad revenue as possible. They should be held to a standard that doesn't allow them to do that. It actually holds them to make sure that terrorism and hate speech and everything that creates negative animosity and spreads misinformation is actually kept at bay on their platforms. On our contention 2, we tell you that it's their ethical responsibility to look after their users for all social media platforms, but they're currently not being held to that standard. And this ruling would be a great step towards actually making sure that Twitter and all other platforms which will follow suit in fear of lawsuits will actually begin to improve their lacking systems that are clearly lacking. They're not enforcing their own terms of services. This would force them to improve on not just one platform, but all platforms. And lastly, on contention 3, we give you influence on other platforms and ideas. Once again, we tell you that there are lots of social media platforms out there. Twitter's a small example, but Twitter's a significant example because Twitter generates a lot of energy and opinion around not just America, but around the world. And there are many sources like TikTok, Facebook, Instagram that have threatening information and misinformation spread around them. And ultimately, this ruling would be a huge step towards starting to bay that misinformation. Now, the negation makes a couple of responses that don't directly respond to anything that we say. And ultimately, they don't actually end up contesting our link chain or our impact. So we have access to all of those. But for our first contention, they respond to saying that Twitter's not responsible in the slightest. And basically, they're so many videos on the platform that there's really no way that they should be held responsible for the fact that Tomney, agreeing to their terms of services, posted that ISIS content, for example. But ultimately, that's not what we're arguing here. It should be Twitter's responsibility to enforce their terms of services, which they're clearly not doing right now, or else we wouldn't have this case at all. Since you have this case, we can immediately correctly assume that Twitter is not doing the job that it's supposed to do in enforcing the behavior of their own users right now. And ultimately, by ruling in favor of Tomney versus Twitter Incorporated, we would actually be taking a big step towards making sure that these social media platforms actually stand up to their own standards that they set for their users on their platforms. Next, on our contention too, they tell you that there's already a system to check for bad content in the status quo right now. And Tawney already agreed to the terms of services. And so this means that everything he did was completely legal according to the First Amendment. First of all, the First Amendment doesn't defend of violence, terrorism, the encouragement of that. And also, second of all, the negation says that already, like Twitter's overloaded. So there's not, in a perfect world, it would be able to do what we're saying that it's going to do if they rule in favor of Tawney, as in actually implementing far better strategies to keep terrorism off their platforms. But then they also go on to tell you that this system already exists, so they contradict themselves, and ultimately we win on the system of moderation because we tell you the moderation is clearly not good enough. They're literally recommending, the platform is willingly programmed to recommend terrorism and ISIS threats on the platform to generate as many clicks as possible. So ultimately, they're not doing a job. They're doing nothing towards stopping this at the moment, and they really need to do so as per their terms of services. And this ruling, only voting for the government, actually achieves that here. And lastly, on our contention too, they talk about morality. They say that we're debating on terms of services that already exist, and Tawney already agreed to their terms. So really, Twitter's in the right for suing Tawney or other way around. And so they cannot actually check every single video. So it's Tawney getting caught. It's his responsibility to stand up for what his actions are. But that's not the point here. The fact that Twitter let ISIS propaganda spread around their platform in the first place, regardless of what Tawney did on their platform as far as terms of services, allowing that to spread at all is the issue at hand, and only the government solves that at the moment. And once again, they give you the argument about morality can only really exist in a perfect world where Twitter has all the money it needs to implement this, but ultimately it can exist now. My partner already tells you it's extremely easy to do this. There are already filtering services available. For example, on YouTube, these filtering services are available, but of course, YouTube doesn't actually implement them themselves. It's the individual channels that have to do it, and few channels actually know how to, because these companies aren't held to the standards that they should be as far as staying up to their terms and services. And lastly, they also once again repeat the fact that social media companies already have systems in place to like moderate themselves. Like Instagram put the blurred screen during COVID-19 in case it was misinformation. But then why are there so many anti-vaxxer like arguments and remarks being spread around the internet? So why are so many people proudly proclaiming they're an anti-vaxxer on the internet? On Twitter, even, for example, there's so many people who just constantly spread anti-vaxxer information. Even if Instagram takes this tiny step that's clearly insignificant and not good enough, it's not significant enough. We need to actually show that there are repercussions for not standing up to your own standards. And they also drop our contention 3, which ultimately states that this ruling has a far bigger impact than just Twitter. This affects all social media platforms that want to actually have users and attract users, because ultimately this has a legitimacy argument. Platforms that take steps towards curbing violence and terrorism on their platform will have more legitimate backgrounds, and they'll attract more users, and this will ultimately lead to a safer internet overall. Moving on to their only contention, which basically falls immediately. They tell you that Tawney and Twitter, for that matter, has terms of conditions, and so ultimately to use the platform, you have to agree to those terms of conditions. Since Twitter's a private company, they're not required to follow the First Amendment. So this contradicts their point in the very beginning, saying that Tawney under the First Amendment could spread ISIS propaganda, but Twitter's a private company, so it doesn't really fall under the First Amendment. Rather, their terms of services says that you cannot spread propaganda or ISIS or terrorism, violence, any of that. You can't encourage any of that on their platform, but they let it happen with Tawney. They led to people's lives being lost. So certainly there's a problem at hand here, and it's Twitter's responsibility for not even enforcing their own terms of services. And so ultimately this turns to our side completely, because it is Twitter's responsibility. It's not taking rights away from people that use their platform. It's their responsibility to uphold their own standards. They tell you that Twitter's not under the First Amendment, so Twitter's not taking rights away from anyone. They set their own rules, and if they don't follow them and this leads to lives being lost, that's not okay. And so ultimately this is just a government ballot, because we save lives and we make a safer internet.
All right, I'm Kirit Puji, and I am the second speaker for the negation side, and my time will begin on my first word. Judges, the first thing you have to understand is that our opponents do not understand the actual case at all, and that negates all of their arguments. So let me explain to you what the case actually is. In this case of Twitter versus Tom Ney sued Twitter because he violated their policies, and Twitter clapped back and instead deleted his account. This completely negates all of their arguments. They state that we are arguing about whether Twitter should have the responsibility to enforce policy that keeps terrorism at bay. But guess what, judges? They already have that policy in place. The reason the reason he sued Twitter was based on these one point that he thought that they did not inflict his right of free speech, and that they were taking that right away from him by deleting his account. So no, Twitter already does this. Twitter already enforces their policy that keeps terrorism at bay. And they already do that. They also claim that Tom Ney spread ISIS propaganda, and they did, and he did, and that is exactly why, judges, Twitter deleted his account. Again, that is exactly why Tom Ney sued Twitter. He sued Twitter because he thought that Twitter took away his terms of free speech. So also, this point is completely invalid, as they are claiming that Tom Ney could spread all of the propaganda that he wanted, and Twitter just let him run with it. But again, this is completely wrong, and it's exactly why Tom Ney sued. Additionally, they claim that social media platforms will improve systems if it is ruled by Twitter. However, this does not mean it at all. Again, judges, this resolution is acting upon the basis of free speech. Tom Ney is claiming that because he violated Twitter's policies and Twitter has deleted his account, he claims that Twitter removed his rights of free speech. Well, judges, if you vote an affirmative ballot, then you would be agreeing with this. You would be agreeing with the fact that Tom Ney can spread ISIS propaganda and that Twitter can't do anything to stop it, even though he violated their policies. So no, their point about the fact that other social media platforms would look to this and prevent terrorism is completely inaccurate. In fact, judges, the exact opposite would happen in this case. In this case, it would mean that other social media platforms would not be allowed to enforce their policies, as this would be considered violating their free speech, even though it would be by their policies. And that's exactly what the opposite of what the negative ballot would do. The negative ballot would ensure that if anyone else tries to spread terrorism or other propaganda on other different social media sites, it would mean that social media sites would be allowed to delete their accounts and to remove this act of terrorism and propaganda and stop it from spreading. So our opponents have very good points, but they are not in the scope of this resolution. They do not make sense if you have an affirmative ballot. After all, our opponents do not understand what the actual case is, and that is a very key point, judges. They claim that Twitter generates a lot of opinions, and other social media do too. And we completely agree with this. But again, judges, going back to what the actual court case means, if you vote for an affirmative ballot, you are voting for the fact that social media platforms would not be able to restrict their users' free speech by telling them that their accounts have been deleted because they were spreading propaganda. As in, you will be actively letting people spread propaganda, and social media platforms will be able to do nothing to fix this if you vote an affirmative ballot. This is exactly the point that I'm trying to make, Judge. Also, they claim that we say that Twitter is not responsible at all. However, they are already doing their best effort to keep their users from participating in fraudulent activity. And this is proved in this same case. After all, again, and I know I keep re-highlighting this, Judge, but it's because it's such an important point. Tom Ney sued because he thought his rights were being infringed because Twitter did something about the fact that he was spreading ISIS propaganda. So again, we claim that Twitter doesn't actually have a moral obligation to do it, and yet they are doing it anyways. And this is a good thing. They are doing their best effort to keep their users from spreading propaganda. And if you vote for an affirmative ballot, then they will not be able to do this. And it will mean that users all across social media platforms will be able to spread propaganda, which is not a good thing, as our opponents have already stated. They also claim that terrorism is recommended. And this is just not necessarily true. As we've already stated, social media platforms are actively taking these posts down because it violates their policies. And judges, terms and policies are at the root of this debate and at the root of this argument. Because social media platforms can set up terms and policies, and their consumers and the people that are using these platforms are forced to abide by those policies. Again, in this case, someone violated that policy as they were spreading propaganda, as our opponents have already stated, and Twitter took their account down. That is the case that is happening at the matter here. And the fact that this happened proves that Twitter was doing something about it. So all of our opponents' arguments are simply invalid here. And if you vote for an affirmative ballot, you are actively encouraging propaganda, and you are actively making it sure and making it stand that not only for Twitter, but as our opponents stated, other social media platforms will be affected by this too. So by voting an affirmative ballot, you would mean that other social media platforms would again be allowed to do this too. After all, judges, I'm going to give you the real heart of this debate. Tom Nate claims that Twitter policies are unconstitutional and that the company violated his First Amendment rights to free speech. What our opponents, again, don't seem to understand is that this case does not revolve around whether social media should stop active terrorism on their platform or not. After all, it has been established already that Twitter actively tries to stop terrorism. In their terms and policies when you sign up, it specifically states that they can, they will, and they often do delete accounts that resolve in terrorism. If you vote for an affirmative ballot, you are voting for the fact that Twitter cannot remove an account that posts propaganda, as Tom Nate did. And that would mean that you are actively encouraging propaganda and actively encouraging all of the bad things that our opponents have already stated. So let's go back to our basic framework and what our case is, which is why you should win. You should vote for the op. Again, Twitter has the right to again, at the current moment, Twitter has the right to delete accounts and stop certain things from being posted based on the principle that if you sign up for their account and if you sign up with their service, then you are clicking the little box that says you agree to their terms, services, and policies. And when you agree to that, you're agreeing to everything else that they state within that. And one of those things, among the many, many things listed in there, is that you are not allowed to post things relating to terrorism or propaganda or misinformation. And as Twitter is actively working to make sure that this does not happen and to make sure that these posts are taken down, it would mean that everything that the opponents are saying is simply completely wrong. When you vote for an affirmative ballot, you are saying that Twitter should not be able to do this, and that other social media platforms will again not be allowed to go through and delete the accounts and delete the misinformation, propaganda, and all of the other things that they are allowed to do. Again, they are legally allowed to do this by the law currently because they do not have to comply with the First Amendment because they are a private company that is not a federal, state, or local government actor. However, if you vote affirmative for this ballot, then you are effectively removing all of these rights that the companies have to delete accounts and delete certain accounts that violate the terms and policies. So it does not make sense for anyone to vote for an affirmative ballot. That is why you should vote for an opposition ballot. Thank you.
All
All
right,
right, I'd like to, yeah. Go ahead.
I'll now begin my second speech for the op. Is everyone ready? All right, time to start my first word. Should a company be penalized for one out of the billions of individual users' bad decisions? This debate essentially boils down to this. Thomas sued Twitter for quote unquote violating his First Amendment rights when the exception to being required to follow the First Amendment is a private company, which Twitter is. Twitter is a private company. Tomna agreed to the terms to not promote terrorism, then proceeded to promote terrorism. The verdict is clear. Tomna is guilty. They argue that Twitter is responsible, that Twitter has the moral obligation to censor all potentially dangerous content, yet they already do. Twitter has poured massive amounts of resources into regulating content. In our opponent's next speech, they will tell you about how it is Twitter's moral obligation to regulate all content. But even if you believe everything they're saying, you have to realize that, as the resolution states, the whole purpose of this debate is to act as the Supreme Court. We are evaluating this case based on the Constitution, like the Supreme Court does. Whenever our opponents say propaganda and misinformation, remember that voting affirmation for this resolution would actively follow this to run rampant, and it would give companies no legal basis to take down these accounts. We win because we act as the Supreme Court to identify Tamna as guilty of violating the terms that Tamna agreed to. Again, these terms are allowed legally because the exception to the freedom of speech rights that the Constitution states is that the company is a private company, which Twitter is. Twitter is a private company and therefore has the right to have its users agree to its terms of service when they log on to the website. Tamna did agree to these terms of service, but after agreeing, he then proceeded to promote terrorism, which goes directly against what the terms of service stated. Clearly, he is guilty. And again, this debate should be judged on what the Supreme Court decision should be. The resolution is resolved. The Supreme Court of the United States should rule for Tamna, or should rule for Tamna in Twitter. And we're saying no, because the Supreme Court should not rule for that, because the Supreme Court makes decisions based on the Constitution, and Tamna has clearly gone against the Constitution by violating the rights that Twitter has already set. Judge, I will ask you again. Should a company be penalized for one out of the billions of individual users' bad decisions? Of course not. For these reasons, we strongly urge Negate to allow social media platforms to take down accounts that revolve around misinformation and propaganda. Twitter did nothing wrong. They had already taken down the account, therefore showing that they had already taken action that they could given the time frame. For these reasons, we strongly negate. Thank you.
Okay, is everyone ready for the final government side speech?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, if everyone is ready, the time for the speech will begin right now. Judge, the negation side has one clear flaw. They don't actually understand the case they are debating. We tell you that along with Gonzalez versus Google, which is one of the cases we mentioned, Tamna is one of two cases where social media companies are accused of aiding and abetting terrorism in violation of the law. Judge, they are framing it in such a way that they think that Tamna is guilty or not guilty. That's not what we're saying here. This case clearly tells you, well, what we are saying is, should Twitter and other companies be reliable? Twitter and other companies such as Google be liable for spreading this misinformation. Remember, all this misinformation spread before the account was actually taken down. So we tell you, why should that happen? Why should they actually be responsible? We tell you that there are three contentions that come completely conceded by the negative side. First, we tell you about internet safety, which is the largest.
There's a PO.
Hey,
Can we stop for a second? Yeah.
Yeah.
You guys have a PO?
The state in which the way I stated the case is correct. Tanmay sued Twitter because he thought that they violated his rights of free speech and his First Amendment because they took down his account. And the point that you're making that, oh, Twitter let their misinformation spread isn't even valid because, again, they took down his account. So it doesn't make sense to frame it in the way that you're framing it.
No, wait, is this counter my speech?
Is this a POI or this is a PO? I thought it was a PO. Can we just stop the time and restart after we're done with the discussion?
No, because we looked at multiple sources and we can clearly tell you that Twitter versus Tamna is about whether aiding and abetting. This is about Twitter and other online companies. It spurred off Google versus Gonzalez, which is also about a point of spreading misinformation. Okay, with that being said, I'm going to resume time. I was at 54 seconds. Time for this speech will begin right now. We tell you that internet safety is on the line and therefore public safety will be harmed. We tell you that we don't take any action in this case, then what's going to happen is that internet safety is going to go down and ISIS is going to keep spreading misinformation, and we tell you that that's bad. The negation side somehow says that they also support this, but they say vote the negation. But Judge, as we tell you again, they don't actually understand the case. They don't understand who's guilty and who's not guilty. Then we talk about ethical responsibility. They simply dismiss this contention and says it's not the ethical responsibility and it's impossible to actually have these systems put in place. But again, as we tell you time and time again, we tell you that this right now systems are already in place, and even if Twitter has people are being forced to sign these terms and conditions, well, these ideas aren't being enforced, which is why these ideas are running rampant. We tell you that this is the biggest impact in this round, and we tell you that the impact for our contention too is that there's going to be more, is that other companies will follow suit, which we'll touch on contention 3, but we tell you that that's going to correct the speech that's happening, and we're going to also solve other problems. We tell you that this is a precedent-setting case that's going to solve all of that is going to lead to a step of solving all the problems that are currently happening in social media. Then we go to our contention 3, where we clearly tell you that this will influence other platforms. Judge, here's here. If you are not yet convinced that the negative side has completely misinterpreted this debate, here's why. Why do you think that we're saying that it's going to influence other platforms? It's going to influence other platforms because now they're being held responsible. Twitter is being held responsible. If Twitter is held responsible for the actions of Tom, then what's going to happen is now that all these other companies are also going to be held responsible. They're going to have to be paid money or some kind of compensation. We tell you that is huge because now other companies are now incentivized to act in similar ways, which means the internet is safer and less terrorism happens in general. Then we get to our only point and their only contention, which was responsibility. Judge, there is a huge logical flaw in this contention. Their two speakers interpret this completely differently. One of them says that they support the affirmative side, except that the affirmative side is actually the negative side. Then your other speaker comes up and says that Hamlet is responsible. Then both of them talk about this First Amendment stuff. First of all, as my partner already told you, terrorism is not supported at all under the First Amendment. We tell you that, sure, even if Twitter is somehow not protected under the First Amendment, we tell you that this spreading of terrorism and other misinformation is absolutely not protected under the First Amendment, as it's just going to cause a harm to the government. It's an inherent harm to the government and everyone of people. Then we tell you that right now, sure, people are checking boxes that say terms and conditions, but what is Twitter's fault? Twitter is letting this misinformation spread because of Tom actually doing this. Sure, he was putting this and he sued Twitter, and now what's happening is that Twitter is the one that is being challenged. Twitter is the one that is basically saying, should there be responsibility? Should there be responsibility or not for this happening? We tell you that is the only way that you can frame this debate. So how are we winning? First, we are the only site that actually provides clear links and impact. You can flow through all of our 3 contentions, where we tell you that the internet is going to be safer. It has an ethical responsibility, which therefore translates into helping more people. And we tell you that this is going to be a precedent-setting case in which it is going to influence more people and more social media platforms in the future. Their only contention has been knocked down by saying, sure, companies right now are responsible. Well, we tell you they're not actually taking this responsibility, which is why you're looking towards the government side of this debate. Again, the resolution says that the Supreme Court of the United States should rule for Tomnet. Twitter should be responsible. Other companies should be responsible for all the terrorism that is spreading. They should be responsible for all the problems that are solving. You cannot ignore all the impacts, Judge. The impacts are simply too huge to ignore. The negation is not engaged side contradicts themselves multiple times, as it does not well interpret the actual framing and laws of this actual case and this debate in general. For all these reasons, you're only looking towards the government side of this debate. Thank you.
All right, so I guess great debate, guys. This was really exciting. All of you guys performed very well. I guess there is a fundamental question on the topic itself and how you both have interpreted it. But I guess that's your job to argue, so we'll leave it at that. So why don't the judges go back? We can go and fill our ballots and then come back in a few minutes. So just hang on for a couple.